Okay, good day, everyone, and welcome to this topic, Gearing for Growth, Industrializing the Continent. We've got a panel with us today who are going to be talking on different aspects of that topic. And one of the key issues that we see as we get out of the post-COVID slowdown is that the importance of new investment, new infrastructure that needs to help unlock growth on the continent. We've had a continent that's been very much riding the wave of mineral booms and busts. And one of the challenges is how do we move beyond that? And how do we get into industrializing the continent and shift the structure of production within the continent? There's obviously a key role for your strong economies on the continent. So South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and in North Africa, we've got Egypt. But there are other up-and-coming economies that we see that are playing a very critical role in driving growth. We've got Ethiopia that's doing amazing things despite all the conflict there. And we're also seeing countries in East Africa like Tanzania and Mozambique that are finding ways to unlock growth. So here we are with our panel, and we're going to be looking at very interesting aspects of this for the next hour or so. I do encourage people to put questions in the chat box or in the group chat or the Q&A so we can have some discussion and insights along the way from the audience. Okay, so there's several questions that people will be addressing through the session, and then I'm going to ask them all to speak for 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for some discussion amongst us, and I'll be asking them questions along the way. Our panel includes let me introduce myself first. I'm Saul Levine. I'm from Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies, and we're a research institute based in Pretoria. Our panel members, and I'm just going to take it in order of the brochure that we have, and that's Bernice McLean. Bernice is a marine policy specialist with a strong interest in the oceans economy and sustainable and equitable industrial development. Bernice joined the AUDA NEPAD agency in 2016, and her current role is the AG Head of Industrialization Division, which includes providing support to the AU, member states and regional bodies and other partners in areas of industrialization. Our next panelist is Horman Chitonga, who's a Professor of African Studies and a research associate at PRISM, which is at University of Cape Town in the School of Economics. He's also a visiting research fellow at Yale University and the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. He's written several books, including Industrial Policy and Transforming the Colonial Economy in Africa, as well as other books on industrialization and economic development. I think we've excited to have you as part of our panel. And then our last panelist is Alec Irwin, who was a minister in the Nelson Mandela government and Thabo Mbeki government, and he was Minister of Trade and Industry as well as Minister of Public Enterprises, starting out as Deputy Minister of Finance. He's also spent several years in the trade union movement, and he currently has a research consultancy called Ubu Holdings that he runs, and then he's also spent time on the WTO dispute settlements panel and has served as an advisor to the to UNIDO. Thanks very much, and glad that you're able to join us today. Let's then start off. We're going to start off with our first speaker, which is Bernice. Bernice, over to you, and looking forward to your input.
Thanks, Saul. So thanks very much for the invitation to participate in this very distinguished panel. I find myself not a little bit intimidated, but I'll try to see how I can best answer the questions that were put to us. I'll try to speak a little bit rapidly because there's quite a lot of content, and I'll just go through the questions one by one. So the first question is, how can Africa foster value creation, formal employment, and positive commercial gains? So I think we all know that Africa is currently at the lower end of the global value chain, with its share of global manufacturing at around only 1.9%, so less than 2% of global averages. And we are still relying far too heavily on the export of raw commodities. As a result, there's an urgent need for Africa to rapidly diversify its economies and ensure that added value to everything that we produce is done through an accelerated and sustainable and inclusive industrialization process. So in terms of exporting raw materials, only this will lead further to increased vulnerabilities and will reduce our ability to maximize our potential further. So just also to mention, and I think this is a point that will be touched on by many of the panelists here, the establishment and operationalization of the AFCFTA has created a huge amount of momentum towards Africa's industrialization pathways and will present further huge opportunities for accelerated economic expansion. We need to be able to feed into the regional integration that is offered by the AFCFTA, and as such to increase local production, add value, and ensure regional integration happens in a seamless manner. So moving on a little bit, I think in order to really take things forward, we need to focus both on how to make industrial policy work better, as well as the priorities of how to increase economic integration, absorption of ICT, regulatory certainty, automating business regulations and institutions, improving access to capital and skilled labor force that could yield broader structural change. So to operationalize these priorities, we need to, I think, consider potentially 4 key areas. The first is to identify appropriate policy responses by establishing conducive enabling environments that will really foster innovation and private sector engagement and increase our economic and social resilience to thrive in the face of both the current shocks and future shocks. A proactive government policy, whether it's implicit or explicit, will help to stimulate investment in learning, innovation, commercialization, technological capability that is required to drive innovation and capability accumulation. The second point is really to, in addition to establishing this conducive enabling environment, is also including a priority of agile governance. And this is to help ensure that any potential policy interventions for our industrialization is sufficiently flexible, as well as technically feasible and practically viable to implement a reform agenda. And then linked to this, obviously, is the need to bridge the gap between policy and action. And this is really this really requires a capacitated and resourced institutional framework that is set up for efficient implementation. And lastly, I think Africa needs to formulate its own unique industrialization pathways that are fit for purpose, appropriate for stimulating our economies and improving the well-being of our people. While we have many examples from Europe, East Asia, and so on that provide very useful lessons and best practices, these may not necessarily apply to the specific context of our continent, the current development imperatives, as well as the current global dynamics. I think Africa also has to balance the simultaneous challenges of democratization and development, in addition to a host of other issues. So this will require a fine balancing act of excellence in leadership. So Saul, that's my answer to the first question. Should I just carry on and answer the second and third questions as well?
Yes, please. I think just you don't have to stick religiously to the questions. I think just speak on the key issues, and yeah, okay, we can have some discussion and engage on the content once everyone has spoken. Thanks, Bernice.
So I think talking to the issue of SME expansion and establishing public-private sector partnerships, this is really key to the development of Africa, and really successful implementation of industrial policy. We believe requires clarity about micro and macro level factors on process of engagement with business and responsive capacity on domestic and global development. So the need for Africa to attract and enable foreign direct investment from the private sector is a useful means to facilitate growth. And the focus on domestic resource mobilization, obviously the required policy certainty that I spoke about earlier in terms of an enabling environment, and reduced transaction costs to attract private sector investment to Africa is key. So really we have an imperative to embark on a bold agenda driven by private sector-led investments in industrial transformation. And this includes not only the large-scale industrial development, but also a focus on the smaller, medium enterprises, and also even the informal sector. So in response to this specific imperative, I'll just mention that the African Union has created an SME development strategy that does provide a useful overview to work towards in terms of creating a competitive and diversified economy that's sustainable over the longer term. And that is, it really supports SME and entrepreneurship to generate employment and promote social inclusion. I'll mention very briefly, it has 7 pillars, ranging from creating enabling a business environment to ensure energy access and infrastructure, to facilitating innovation and promoting innovative financing, ensuring access to markets, promoting business development, learning practices, and inclusive entrepreneurship. So there are a couple of key policy actions that will help to achieve these 7 pillars. And I'll just mention 1 or 2 of them and some examples of what we're doing at the African Union Development Agency in support of particularly SME development that might yield some good lessons. So the first is growing liquid and effective capital markets by improving access to market finance for African enterprises, with expanding micro, small, medium enterprise focused lines of credit. And we have an initiative known as the 100,000 SME initiative, or MSME initiative, within AUDA that was operationalized a year ago, and really is looking to accelerate some economic development through greater formalization of MSMEs in Africa. The second policy action was looking at driving enterprise development, also again with a specific focus on micro, small, medium enterprises. And here the focus is really on building the capacity of micro, small, medium enterprises to compete with international players. And again, as part of the 100,000 MSME initiative, we have crafted an academy which is looking to build capabilities of MSMEs in Africa, and giving easy access to training. We hope that will go a long way to supporting this sector. The third is encouraging strong strategic partnerships by linking African enterprises with major projects. And the fourth is developing efficient industry clusters and cross-border value chains and supply chains. We've seen in the COVID impacts, the severe impact on our supply chains, and the associated impact on the more informal, less resilient sectors of our population. So this is something that really we believe needs a strong area of focus to establish African value and supply chains, along with integrating Africa into global value chains. And I think this is also an area where the AFCFTA will come into play in a big way. So just in a point about private sector investment, I think it should not be seen as a substitute for efforts by national governments or contributions from the public sector or multilateral government banks, which are critical to the development of large basic infrastructure for development. What we need in Africa is strong developmentally minded governments that support regional integration and regulate, empower, and support SME business in the private sector to support wealth creation and employment, job creation. So I think, Saul, I'm not sure if I'm beyond time. Should I go on to the next one?
That's fine. I think let's end off there, and we can come back to other issues as we progress through the rest of the session. Let me move across to Horman to try and take us through some of his thoughts and ideas on some of the issues that have been raised. In particular, I think some of the questions around the strength of governments to make those interventions that Bernice has spoken about. I think we've all seen varying capacity within African governments to take forward some of these initiatives. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and your inputs. Thanks very much, Horman. Over to you.
Thank you, So, for that introduction. And thank you, Bernice, for coverage and highlighting the most important parts of what we are speaking about today. I will speak to the question of value highlighted. The continent at the moment adds very little value to the resources that we are extracting, and this has become a big problem in terms of both promoting economic growth, but also dealing with the many social issues that need economic growth to be addressed. And so value addition is very, very critical. Just as an example, the average African country exports, depends largely on export of raw materials with very little value addition. For countries like Chad, Nigeria, Angola, Algeria, almost 80% of export earnings come from one commodity export, oil or gas and in most cases these commodities are exported in raw form, which means that we are adding very little value. And if we look at whether it's a petroleum value chain, Africa gets on average less than 10% of that value chain, and that's not good for economic growth and development on the continent. And given that situation, then the question of how can at the heart of industrial policy, and one of the things I would like to speak to, in this context, is that African countries need to build, industrial capabilities, but also industrial capacity. And I'm just distinguishing here. Industrial capacity relates more to, issues of the hard infrastructure, hard assets, had fixed capital that you need to produce, so manufacture things. Whilst the capability relates largely to skills and technology, and I think the continent has to work very hard to create those enable conditions for value addition. So that's very critical where we stand. And when we do research on the continent, including South Africa and Morocco and Algeria, where we think that the economies are a little bit more advanced, we still come up with a problem of skill shortages. And that you speak to investors, they'll tell you, I can't find technicians, I can't find also technological capabilities. So that's very important for me. The other issue that most African countries need to address is the issue of, Bernice raised this again in her presentation, is the issue of designing and implementing a coherent and supportive industrial policy. And I emphasize their implementing because, again, if you look at the continent, at least in the last 10 years, we've had several countries designing industrial policy. But the implementation of that has left a lot more to be desired. And I think that's where the problem is. We have to begin to ask ourselves, how do we translate what we have on paper into action that can result into building these capacities, building these capabilities that we are talking about. As far as I know, by 2018, almost 34 African countries had developed industrial policies. in the last decade or so. Of course, some countries have been doing this for a longer time, but the implementation of this has been very problematic, including here in South Africa. That we have several documents that are clear in what they want to do, but the implementation on the ground has been problematic, and I think we need to address that issue. And one of the biggest issues that I find in implementation of industrial policy is coherence. And I always say that industrial policy is very, coordination sensitive, in the sense that if there's lack of coordination and different parts of that policy direction, it's very difficult to make any in terms of industrial development and industrialization. So that's critical across the continent. The other key thing that I want to raise, which is related to this conference, is the issue of infrastructure. Again, infrastructure serves as a foundation on which you build any economic activity. And infrastructure can be disaggregated into roads, energy, infrastructure for digital services and so on and so forth. All those, I think, are critically important for the continent to be able to build these capacities and capabilities that have been to industrialize. Just for energy, as an example, we have countries that have rolling, power curve for 8 hours in a day. How do you sustain production when you have no power? We recently did a study in Zambia on agro-processing. Most of the people we spoke to there were saying, look, I can't run my maize milling machine because it needs 2 hours to warm up before we can start producing. But then I switch it on for 2 hours, and then the next 6 hours, there's no supply. So how do I operate? So that's just a basic example of how critical infrastructure is in this sense. The other arm of infrastructure is, of course, the infrastructure for digital services. We are all speaking about the fourth industrial revolution and how Africa can, take advantage of that. But we won't make any headway in that direction as long as we don't have the basic infrastructure to make data available to people who need it, to people in industries. And that's very critical as well. The other key point I want to raise on value addition is that the continent needs to work together to identify some of the key value chains or strategic value chains in which countries have, what I would refer to as revealed comparative dynamic revealed comparative advantage. We are in a global economy and we can't be competitive in everything. So it's important for us as a continent to say, which value chains can we actually capitalize on to build? Not to stay where we are in terms of comparative advantage, because if you analyze any comparative advantage structure on the continent, is that we are tending towards commodity extraction. But that comparative advantage structure can be changed if we begin to say, where can we actually make progress? And I think that conversation needs to come in quite strongly if we are going to create avenues for adding value. On the issue of the private-public sector coordination, I think that is also very critical. Again, we have seen a bit of a shift on the continent from an ideological point of view that used to see the private sector as, foreign capital that's coming to eat into the independence of the country and so on. I think that discourse is very unhelpful. We begin to see countries that are seeing the private sector as a partner in development, and a critical partner in development, in the sense that private investors will bring capital that can help us build some of these if we are coordinating those actions properly. And when private investors thrive, a country's economy, a country's employment, will grow, and that's a benefit that comes to the country, largely. And so the dichotomous way in which we have, viewed this relationship between the public and the private sector has actually done a lot of harm. And for Africa to make progress, we need to shift the perception of the private sector as, a partner in development. Of course, the public sector, the state, can lead the process, but carry along with them the private sector in the direction that the state wants to move. I've never seen a private sector that resists that. They are into business to make money. As long as they can make money in a way that brings the benefit to the country, that should be promoted. Yeah, and
let's end off there for this initial round of comments. Let's move across to Alec. I think you've raised already some very, very important points that I think just, a handful of them will keep us discussing for hours. But let's move across now and hear from Alec. And some of also, Alec, I'm interested about your very practical experiences of working with Togo and trying to unlock some of the development there. Over to you, Alec.
Well, thank you, Saul. Thanks to Herman and Bernice. I agree with the issues they've raised, certainly. I thought maybe if I stood back a little bit and said, what is the context in which industrialization is going to be occurring in Africa? Because I think there's a tendency to think it's a process that's stood still. It hasn't. It's a very different set of forces at work, in my view, in the process of industrialization. And both Bernice and Herman have hinted at that. But so the first step, I think, for any serious attempt at industrialization is essentially a kind of almost political step. And that's a commitment, a leadership commitment. And that's a leadership both in the political terrain and in the private sector. And that leadership must also commit to talking to each other, as you've all indicated. So it's important to understand where your economy actually stands. I think if you've got an economy like Nigeria or Angola that's heavily dependent on a single commodity export, that has major financial, fiscal, and potential industrialization impacts. If I'm a relatively small economy, but with rich natural agricultural resources like a Rwanda, clearly I've got to examine a slightly different path. So in my view, each country has to first examine its position, see what might be possible. This is something a bit broader, I think, than just the conventional economic comparative advantage. It's a look at the institutions, it's a look at the strategic routes to the sea, it's a look at your neighbors, it's a look at what capacities you have in your own society. And then to understand that the process of industrialization is significantly different now than it was even 30 years ago. And what I'm stressing here is that modern industrialization is exceptionally efficient. We know also its problems of where we're going to have to make massive structural changes to address its unintended consequences, but it's very, very efficient. So if I start industrializing in a major economy like even South Africa or Nigeria, and all I do is raise the cost of my products, I'm creating a massive tension in my economy, because available in a traded form is much more affordable products, more in demand for consumers, meeting consumer needs. Yet I'm adopting policies or trying to adopt policies that are really just raising my cost structure. So there's a fundamental tension that modern industrialization, catching up with it is hard work. This is not like I used to have a steel plant. I've just got to put a steel plant in. You've got to put in a lot more capacities, as you were saying, Herman. And this is really why no country will industrialize unless there's a serious commitment and a consistent commitment to achieving the kind of overall environment that could allow for industrialization. And each country will have to chart its own path, coming from its history and what its endowments are and what it thinks its possibilities are. I think that's crucial. There's a tendency to think that as soon as I put in a policy, industry will come. It won't. It won't. The capital has possibilities to invest where it's more efficient. So, as you've all stressed, a serious analysis is done. There's no prospect whatsoever of any serious industrialization with energy systems as we see in Africa. Virtually every, before agro-processing, if your maize meal plant went down for 2 hours, it didn't matter too much. But now I'm competing with a plant where that maize meal plant is producing 24 hours a day, very efficiently. It can produce it to a fine quality because the energy quality is constant and good. You talked about Togo. In Togo, if I was industrializing, it depended where the electricity was coming from. If it came in from Ghana, it came in at 1 megahertz reading. If it came in from Nigeria, it came in at another megahertz reading. So if I was operating a relatively sophisticated machine, I had to do a massive, very quick switch or have damage to my machine. So these basic systems that you've been stressing are fundamental, and there has to be a plan for it, and it has to be consistent. And that consistency is crucial, I think. If you not consistent, industry's investment time span is much longer than retail. It needs longer recovery periods. And then I think learning to work together, the public and the private, this is absolutely fundamental. South Africa's transition was absolutely dependent on that ability to work together systematically and reach mutually useful agreements between the public and the private sector. And let me just then finish by saying we've actually given ourselves an interesting challenge. Historically, free trade agreements have followed industrialization. They haven't preceded it. So we're moving in a rather unusual manner in Africa where we're trying to liberalize our trade when there are very low levels of industrialization. Now, that's a challenge. It could be very tempting for South Africa and Egypt and Morocco to say, oh, great, we'll supply all the industrial goods. But that's not a recipe for Africa's development. So we have to have industrial policies within the free trade agreement. The advantage of the free trade agreement, as I think the negotiators are now discovering, is that free trade agreements force you to understand your economy. Because now you've got to make decisions about rules of origin, value chains. How can you build value chains? The concept of accumulation in a free trade agreement is precisely to accommodate value chains. So now you've got to understand, how do I do that? What levels can I reach? What's going to happen? So it's a wonderful opportunity for us to actually deal with the intense detail that has to underpin an industrial policy. And that's my last point. There are certain generic aspects, and Bernice, you've mentioned them, Orman, you've mentioned them, that are crucial for any industry. But actually, for a particular industrial chain, the ones that we're looking at in the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, in auto, in pharmaceuticals, in textiles, in certain types of agro-processing, each of those value chains needs different types of structure in order to bring them to life. The auto sector requires a completely different approach to industrial policy to that needed for light manufacturing. So this is again where each country has to focus. They're not going to be able to take the policies off the shelf and implement them. You have to create them yourselves in a compact between the public and the private sector. But we've got a wonderful opportunity, but it's hard work, detailed work, and requires a political commitment from public and private that we are going to industrialize. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, so we've got a lot on our plate. I've got a couple of questions that I think would be useful to discuss. And the first one is, so we've got these commodity-dependent economies in Africa, and that earn most of the export revenue, but it gives those commodity producers enormous political power, economic power and political power. But one of the things that we see is that when we start the industrialization process, they have the potential to block some of these developments because they quite enjoy their prime position in the economy. They enjoy the advantages of not competing with domestic policies that require them to buy local. And some of them are engaged in activities around profit shifting so that they have offshore tax havens, and buying local means that it subverts some of their requirements. And then there's also a pricing issue. And I think that's one of the things that we've seen, particularly in South Africa, where there's levels of economic development, but we have a tension between the upstream that wants to benefit from this price advantage and disadvantages the downstream through a variety of mechanisms. Let's open that up, because I think it's one of our key starting points is how do we, because Horman, you've said we need to beneficiate our materials, but if we're seeing this tension, and I think Alec has spoken to it as well, if we're seeing this tension between the primary and the downstream and the beneficiation, how do we get that right? We don't have to come up with all the answers, but let's have some ideas on getting it right. Let me, I don't know, Alec, you already unmuted. So do you want to tackle that? And then Horman, you can go. Bernice, you don't have to answer it, but you're welcome to if you want to. Okay?
I think you've touched on an extremely important point. I mean, in my experience, the very first policy decision you have to make if you're choosing an industrial path is what is your trade policy? Are you going to use tariffs and tariff protection for revenue purposes, or are you going to use them for industrial development purposes? Very few governments make that choice. You have to make it explicitly, and it's got to then be implemented. That means that you've then also got to bring your customs authority on board, your ministries of finance on board. The coordination and coherence you talked of, Horman, is fundamental. What you see in Africa is a complete disjuncture between the revenue services that see tariffs as a revenue source, and a very important one because of the poor tax collection systems, and ministries of trade and industry trying to introduce industrial policy that would require over time the reduction of tariffs. You can't keep tariffs high and industrialize. You must slowly reduce them at a rate that you can accommodate. So I would say the answer to your question, Saul, is first that fundamental choice. What is our priority? Is it revenue collection, or is it an industrialization process? Secondly, the organizations that have got a great deal to do with the success of industrialization are your customs administration and your tax administration. So you've got to pay attention to those and see that they work. It's also why you need to talk. If as a government you try and impose a policy on powerful economic interests, they've got the capacity to block that. So this is where you have to bring all those different economic interests together and try and thrash out a mutually beneficial process. Very few African governments are strong enough to dictate to the powerful existing interests, let alone dictate to international capital. So those processes of planning, thinking, consultation, bringing people on board, looking at the right administrations to correct first, are really essential for industrialization. There's no formula that you can pull off a shelf.
Thanks. Horman, your views on this?
Thank you. So, yes, that's a critically important point on the tension that we see, particularly in terms of if you analyze the supply chain, downstream industries always find it difficult to survive if if the upstream inputs or intermediate products coming in, particularly if they are sourced locally, are overpriced. And one of the problems that create that are these monopolies, of course, that big industrial firms that almost price setting for their products, which are used downstream. And some of them, of course, are politically connected and are seen as, pillars of the economy and not be, touched. But that, for instance, if you take high pricing of inputs, it has serious consequences within the economy. And part of the, solution to that is to think about, the different players. And I think this is where policy can come in to say, what do we benefit from, having high input prices that affects the activity of the downstream, firms. Again, as Alec mentioned, that needs to be part of a coherent industrial policy that can address the whole range of actors to be able to leverage more out of the economy. I think that's an important point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Horman. Bernice, anything to add on this, or can I throw another question your way?
You can. I can add a little bit, but you can ask another question in the interest of time, no problem.
Okay, so the key issue for small business, and you touched on this in your input as being absolutely critical, is, so we obviously want small businesses that are going to be more than traders, who buy goods from, China or India, and then they're just selling at a small markup. We're looking for small businesses that are adding value. And one of the key benefits of a thriving and dynamic small business sector is that it supports the growth of the big players. So an example might be is if you've got a big machine that you've bought from somewhere else, you need to be able to service it. You need to be able to make sure that you've got the input material so that it can run the full operations. You need technicians if there's a breakdown. So there's a whole range of small businesses that operate around bigger enterprises. How has your work been looking at unlocking those opportunities and getting the big enterprises to think about their supply chain and how do they support the growth of the small businesses within their domestic economies?
Thanks, Saul. I think just to start off, just to say, I think we're realizing, and much more lately due to COVID impacts, as I mentioned earlier, that our informal and small enterprises are actually the backbone of Africa's economies. So if we don't focus on these primarily to help them to grow, to establish and to support the broader value chains, then we're really undoing what we need to do as a development agency. So in terms of our work with SMEs or MSMEs, we really, as I mentioned, are trying to look at how to scale up. So looking at how to support the most basic functions of MSMEs, whether it's at their business functioning, getting them formalized, if that's the way they want to go, getting them recognized within the formal economy, so that they can receive some of the benefits that the bigger enterprises get, and then capacitating them just in terms of operationalizing them within the economic sectors. And I think we're really in the early stages at the moment. We're taking a number of sort of different approaches, both in terms of looking at large impact in terms of larger numbers of MSMEs, so through our platforms on development and so on, but also looking specifically at learning lessons from accelerating specific levels of SMEs. And one example is what we're calling the Homegrown Solution Business Accelerator for Africa's pandemic resilience. where we've selected a very small number in a specific region of businesses that have been supporting the health sector, and have crafted with them a specific accelerator plan that is based on priorities of linking them up to investment, of improving their business planning, linking up with potential partners, and also providing that policy enabling space to link them to government and other policy actors, so that they can contribute to the voice on policy. So those are some of the sort of practical examples that we're doing. But I think there is a strong recognition, and this goes back to both what Alec and Horman have said previously. The need for an enabling environment to recognize the role of these actors in the value chains, whether it is the operationalization of large scale businesses or industrial entities, or just in terms of economic development. But these actors do play an essential role in those value chains, and we need to recognize that in the policy space, and allow for them to have rights and responsibilities within that. So thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. Horman, Alec, anything to add on that question?
No, I'm delighted to hear about the work that Bernice is talking about, because I think the biggest problem facing small and medium enterprises is that they've got no supportive environment, basically. And particularly, one area we haven't touched on, but is really quite crucial, food processing. If you now want to trade any kind of agro-processing into a sophisticated market, you're going to meet really considerable phytosanitary standards and NTBs and stuff like that. And that's understandable. These days, people are not prepared to take the risk of taking a product and not knowing what's in that product, and also not knowing whether the certification of that product is reliable and accurate or not. So this is one of the contexts, I think, where industrialization's changed. Previously, small, medium exporting, or even big stuff like cocoa from Ghana, just relied on what the central economies did. But now if you want to process these things in Ghana, you've got to put in your own standards, your own phytosanitary certification. You've got to make certain that will be accredited and accepted by your trading partners if you want to trade. So, I think that's pretty sophisticated standards, homologation, compliance levels, certification. The advantage, though, is that IT technology can simplify and make that accessible, whereas it wasn't before. So the supportive infrastructure for SMEs, in my view, is far and away more important. It's not a lack of economic activity. It's a lack of supportive infrastructure for those sectors to grow. But it's wonderful that you're focusing on it. I think it's essential.
Thanks, Alec. Horman, anything to add on that issue?
Yeah, thanks. So, yes, and I agree with Bernice that the small and medium enterprises are the backbone of the African economy. You don't have, in most countries, you don't have these big, large-scale multinational companies. And it's important also what Alec mentioned there, that you have to be able to create an environment in which these small enterprises can be sustained, the business can be sustained, but also they can grow. And one of the important thing, particularly even in the domestic context, without thinking, most of the small enterprises on the continent they supply into the domestic market. They're not yet sophisticated to supply into the global market. But even within the domestic market, again, we need to create capacity for them to become efficient, because if the small supplier who are supplying the big guys are inefficient, then that brings inefficiency in the big guys and eventually in that value chain. And that becomes very difficult for us to be competitive, even when we're thinking of jumping into the global market. So the efficiency of the small supply component of our economy is the small, medium enterprises. And the point that Alec mentioned about very critical, because that's how you create efficiency. Just an example of, how, linking these suppliers into international companies has helped some of them to upgrade. The example is ShopRite. ShopRite's, the different suppliers into ShopRite, they're given, not very stringent but fair, conditions on how you can supply, in terms of your quality, in terms of your quantity, in terms of your health standards. And I've seen in several countries, we just did one in Uganda, they have improved, and Tanzania, Zambia as well. It has resulted in farmers supplying into that market actually upping their game. And I think that's one way of supporting the small businesses by subjecting them to that rigorous process that they can upgrade and grow and perhaps even leap into the global market. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. We don't have much time left, so I'm just going to throw open to one last question, and then as we answer that, just to give some closing remarks as well. So it's the issue of infrastructure. I think the electricity has been raised already as a very key issue. You can't industrialize without electricity, I think, is a starting point. But the other part of infrastructure is the logistics and the border infrastructure. If we want to, we're talking about an AFCFTA with inter-country travel and trading opportunities, and also, trying to grow economies through that collaboration. Where are we going with some of the infrastructure developments, particularly around moving goods between countries much more efficiently? Woman, I know that you need to drop off quickly, so I'll give you the chance to briefly respond to that, and then I'll go to Bernice and Alec, if you can also wrap up at the same time. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, infrastructure is key. And the logistics infrastructure needs a lot of attention in most countries, and it has been on the agenda for a long time. And I noticed that the African Development Bank has been providing some financial support to upgrade or improve this, but still that hasn't made major impact on the infrastructure. For instance, if you are importing things, copper from the DRC into South Africa, just the infrastructure challenges you face here make you very uncompetitive in terms of the cost price of that, transportation, in terms of the time you spend on different entry ports, because of, there's no infrastructure to process, all the documentation, all the paperwork. Even if we are talking of SADC as a single regional economic community, without even speaking about going outside of SADC. So it's a bigger challenge that we have, and I think for us to be able to promote even the growth of the ACFTA, we will need to upgrade the infrastructure system, the logistical system, whether it's transport or air or train, rail or whatever. That needs to be in place for us to make any significant impact on this ground. And I think that infrastructure is critically important. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bernice, I know NEPAD had its foundations in infrastructure. Do you want to talk to some of those issues?
Thanks, Saul. I don't want to go too overboard, but we have a long history in terms of the continental infrastructure program development and so on. Maybe just to mention one of the initiatives that's we're really trying to focus on to assist with regional integration. And that is what you may have heard of as the one-stop border post approach. That's looking specifically at facilitating trade across national borders along sort of development corridors. So I think that's a critically important initiative that could help to yield some really good lessons that could help other regions also to take them on. It's throwing the light on some interesting challenges and opportunities. And I think central to that, and I'll keep going back to this point, is the need also to really make space for the traders who are not part of the formal system, because a lot of informal trade does happen across borders. So we need to make sure that there are both sort of infrastructural facilities, the hard infrastructure to support that kind of trade, but also the soft facilities. So that's one particular aspect that we're looking at. Just another point that I think is really critical, and this touches on what Alex said earlier in terms of the standards, the SPS standards and so on, in terms of food safety, is the need for quality infrastructure. And by quality infrastructure, I mean the infrastructure that is there to support trade in highly perishable products, for countries to be able to monitor the quality of the products that are going through. Africa is building its national and continental standards portfolios quite strongly, and is putting many countries are putting a lot of effort into their standards authorities and the competent authorities. So I think that's a really great future opportunity to help the AFCFTA. In terms of just closing remarks, I don't want this to get lost anyway, so I think I'll just throw it in at the end, is really in terms of industrialization. I think we also need to focus on the other side of industrialization, the tradable services, what they call the non-smoke stack industrialization areas that really offer huge potential for Africa's development, whether it's tourism or digital technologies or tradable services in those senses. So I think that's also something that we can focus on and help our member states to take it forward for sustainability issues. So thank you. That's from me.
Great. Thanks very much, Bernice. Alec?
Yes, no, I agree with what's been said. I think one factor we've got to bear in mind that when you're looking at developing energy systems now in Africa, given that they're relatively underdeveloped, you actually have to contemplate a long-term primary energy policy. What is going to be your primary energy source to power that electricity system, given that there are significant structural changes that are going to take place in the energy sector. So that's, again, one of these challenges that arises from a new context within which industry now has to operate and poses some really complex and difficult choices that have to be addressed. I've got a rule of thumb that I know that an economy is serious about itself when it's got good border posts. Africa's border posts and South Africa's own border posts are absolutely appalling. I mean, we've seen recently what's happened. I've driven from Accra through to Benin. Going through border posts there, you could not possibly have a cold chain supply route or anything like that by road or by rail or anything. The border posts are just completely underinvested in. Yeah? And we see the same. You've got the absolutely absurd situations at Byte Bridge or Kasane, where if we're serious about trading with our neighbors, I'll only believe that when I see the border posts being put in place, because they really are appalling. And there's no need for all the paperwork that now gets done. We should be having electronic trading systems that could be used, and as you see in Europe and elsewhere. And that's the success of the European market, because there are no serious border posts. Yeah. So I think this has to be a real priority, and it's got to be a commitment. In the absence of upgrading our logistics through the borders and putting in trading systems and trade facilitation systems, we're not serious about continental development. Thank you.
Thanks. And I think that's a perfect way to end the session. Thank you to both of you for your inputs, and thank you to Horman, who had to unfortunately leave to another commitment. It's been a very, very interesting session, and I've also learned a lot and enjoyed the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks all for your facilitation. Thank you.
Now is the time to bend the arc of history, to plan, to shape, to lay the foundations of our future, a future free of poverty, free of helplessness, free of dependency, a future distinguished by progress, by shared prosperity, by bridging gaps in society, building bridges across our continent for the farmer who needs roads, and for families needing clean water. We build services and infrastructure, building our economy that build identity and belonging, building our continent, building our humanity.